is Tyler Jensen. I'm 16 years old, and this happened at the beginning of the summer of 2023. A boy named Noah Carter had just moved into a new neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, and decided to invite some friends over for a sleepover at his house. In the end, only I and another friend of ours, Ryan Mitchell, were able to go. I had never been to that house before. The neighborhood looked exactly like those newly built subdivisions that are popping up all over American cities, with wide streets, neatly maintained sidewalks, and almost every house looking nearly identical. During dinner, Noah mentioned that the residents took security very seriously. Nearly every house had outdoor cameras, automatic floodlights, and monitored alarm systems because there had been several home invasions in the area a few years earlier. His dad even joked that it would be impossible for someone to break into one of those houses without waking up half the neighborhood. After eating pizza, we spent a few hours playing video games in the basement. Noah's mom came down a few times with soda and snacks while his dad watched television in the upstairs living room. It was exactly the kind of night we'd been having since we were kids, with nothing unusual happening. If someone had asked me at that moment how the night would end, I would have said we'd probably stay up late and wake up around noon. It was a little after midnight when we heard a loud beep, followed by a robotic voice coming from the house's alarm panel. It announced something like, "Back door," and immediately began a series of warning beeps. All of us stopped talking at the same time. Noah's dad got up from the couch without looking particularly nervous and walked over to the alarm panel installed near the kitchen. The alarm kept sounding for about 5 or 6 seconds before it suddenly stopped on its own, even before he entered any code. I remember him staring at the display for a few moments with a confused expression. Then he grabbed a flashlight from a kitchen drawer, opened the back door, and went outside to check the backyard. We walked over to the window and watched. The backyard was enclosed by a tall wooden fence, and automatic floodlights illuminated almost everything. He walked around the house for several minutes, checked the side gate, looked around the back door, and calmly came back inside. He said the sensor had probably malfunctioned because of an insect or some electrical issue. Noah commented that nothing like that had ever happened since they moved in, but his dad replied that electronic equipment fails from time to time and told us not to worry. The conversation quickly shifted to something else, but for some reason, I kept thinking about that alarm long after we returned to our video game. We went back down to the basement, trying to act like nothing had happened. At first, we managed to. We kept playing for another half hour, joking around and arguing about which horror movie we should watch afterward. Even so, I noticed that every time the house made a normal creaking sound from the wood or the air conditioning system, someone instinctively looked up. Noah mentioned that the security system could be controlled from the house computer, which was located in the small office next to the living room. He said it half-jokingly, asking if we wanted to figure out what kind of bug had fooled the sensor. It sounded like a good idea. We went upstairs quietly because his parents had already gone to bed. The computer was still on, displaying the security camera software. Noah entered the password and opened the recording history. There were recordings from every outdoor camera organized by time. He rewound to the moment when the alarm had gone off and opened the recording from the camera facing the back door. At first, we saw absolutely nothing. The image showed only the floodlit backyard and the closed door. Then just a few seconds before the alarm sounded, someone slowly appeared from alongside the fence. The person was wearing dark clothing, gloves, and a mask that completely covered his face. He walked to within inches of the back door, stood there staring at it for several seconds, and at the exact moment the alarm went off, he took 2 steps backward and disappeared, running away before any lights inside the house turned on. None of us said a word for several seconds. Noah replayed the video, thinking maybe we'd misunderstood what we'd seen. We watched it again. The exact same sequence happened. The man approached the door, the alarm sounded, and he immediately backed away as if he knew exactly how much time he had before someone appeared. Ryan asked whether it could have been some neighbor playing a really stupid prank. I replied that no neighbor would walk into someone else's backyard wearing a mask in the middle of the night. Out of curiosity, Noah started checking older recordings. He went back to the previous night, then to 2 nights earlier. My stomach started to sink when we realized it hadn't been the first time. On several nights, the same man appeared walking toward the back door at almost the exact same time. In some recordings, he stayed only a few seconds. In others, he stood there for nearly a full minute staring at the house before leaving. The most disturbing detail was that the alarm went off every single time, but it always stopped before anyone in the family managed to reach the door. While we were still trying to make sense of it all, we heard the same electronic announcement echo through the downstairs once again. The panel's voice repeated, "Back door." The alarm had just gone off for the second time that night. The sound of the alarm made the three of us freeze in front of the computer. This time, nobody mentioned a faulty sensor. Noah looked at Ryan and me for a second before running out of the office. We followed right behind him. His dad was already coming downstairs from the second floor, still trying to figure out what was happening. As soon as he reached the alarm panel, he glanced at the screen and grabbed the flashlight again. Before he could open the door, Noah said he had to show him something urgently. His dad replied that he would look afterward and went out into the backyard anyway. We watched through the kitchen window. The floodlights had already switched on automatically, lighting up the entire backyard. He walked to the back door, checked the doorknob, looked behind the grill, walked along the wooden fence, and went to the side gate. There was nobody there. When he came back inside, Noah practically pulled him by the arm to the computer. Without saying a word, he opened the recording from just a few minutes earlier. We all watched in silence. Once again, the masked man appeared from the exact same side of the fence. He slowly approached the door, stood completely still for several seconds, and at the instant the alarm sounded, quickly backed away before Noah's dad opened the door. His expression changed completely as he watched the footage. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely concerned. He immediately started reviewing recordings from previous days. The farther back he went, the worse it became. The same man kept appearing at nearly identical times, always alone, always wearing dark clothes and the same mask. In one recording from 4 nights earlier, he actually reached out and touched the back door handle before stepping away when the alarm sounded. In another, he stood staring at one of the kitchen windows for nearly 2 minutes. None of those recordings had ever been noticed because the family never had any reason to review the camera history. While Noah's dad grabbed his phone to call the police, I heard a snapping sound coming from the backyard. It wasn't the alarm this time. It sounded like someone stepping on the wooden fence. We all instinctively looked toward the kitchen window. We didn't see anyone. Then, almost at the same moment, one of the cameras displayed on the monitor lost signal for a few seconds before coming back online. Noah's dad left the computer and ran to manually lock every door in the house. From the look on his face, it was obvious he no longer believed this was just some curious person wandering around the neighborhood. While Noah's dad checked every door and window, his mom woke up because of all the commotion and came downstairs without understanding what was happening. Noah quickly explained that a man had been showing up on the security cameras for several days. She looked at the computer screen and fell completely silent. A few minutes later, we heard the siren of a police cruiser approaching the street. 2 officers arrived, spoke briefly with Noah's dad, and began searching the backyard with flashlights. We watched everything through both the security cameras and the front windows of the house. The officers found fresh footprints in the soil near the back fence and also noticed that several branches had been broken outside the property, as if someone had been using that path repeatedly to approach the house. While they conducted the inspection, one of the officers asked to see every saved recording. We spent about half an hour showing them the footage. At one point, he asked whether there was a camera covering the side street next to the house. Noah opened that camera and began rewinding one of the earlier nights. That's when we saw something none of us had noticed before. After leaving the back door, the masked man didn't actually leave the area. Instead, he remained hidden behind a parked car on the corner, watching the house for several minutes before calmly walking away down the sidewalk. The officers took a copy of all the recordings and recommended that the family stay with relatives for a few days while the investigation continued. A few weeks later, Noah's dad contacted me to say that the police had arrested a man in a nearby neighborhood after another resident reported someone trying to enter backyards during the night. I never learned all the details of the investigation, but he told me the clothing recovered from the suspect was very similar to what the man in the security footage had been wearing. Even so, investigators were never able to determine how long he had been watching that house or what his true intentions were. What has stayed with me the most wasn't the video of the masked man. It was realizing that, for days on end, he seemed to be testing exactly how long it took for the alarm to go off, how quickly the family reacted, and how far he could get before someone opened the door. If we hadn't decided to check the camera history that night, we probably would have gone to sleep believing the security system was simply malfunctioning. Even today, whenever I hear someone say an alarm went off for no reason, I think back to that night and realize that sometimes the equipment is working exactly the way it's supposed to. Story 2. My name is Owen Parker. I'm 15 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2022, when a friend from school named Caleb Turner invited me to spend the night at his house for the first time. He lived in a small town in northern Pennsylvania, surrounded by dense woods and rural roads. I lived in a busier neighborhood, and I always thought it was strange how his house was so far from town, on a street where hardly any cars passed during the night. The houses were spread far apart, each with a large backyard, and behind them began a wooded area that seemed to stretch for miles. Caleb's parents were very easygoing. We ordered pizza, played video games in the living room, and later moved the console to his bedroom. His room was on the second floor, and the window looked directly onto an empty lot beside the house. Caleb mentioned that the lot had been abandoned for years and that nobody had ever built anything there. From the window, all you could see was tall grass, a few bushes, and an old wooden fence that had collapsed in several places. We didn't pay much attention to it. We spent most of the evening playing games and talking about school until nearly midnight. It was already after 1 a.m. when we turned off the video game and switched off the bedroom light. We lay there talking quietly because neither of us was sleepy yet. The curtain was partially open, and the moon illuminated much of the empty lot beside the house. At one point, Caleb suddenly stopped talking and asked if I could also see a light outside. I looked through the window and spotted a small reddish point moving slowly through the tall grass. It took me a few seconds to figure out what I was looking at. It didn't look like an ordinary flashlight. The light was dim and had a red tint, as if someone had covered the lens with a piece of fabric. It illuminated only a very small circle on the ground as it slowly moved across the lot. A moment later, we were able to make out the silhouette of a man holding that flashlight. He walked extremely slowly, lowering the light to certain spots in the grass, standing still for several seconds, and then moving forward again. He didn't look like someone searching for a lost pet or simply wandering around. It was as if he were carefully examining the ground, illuminating only small sections at a time. The two of us continued watching in silence for several minutes. The longer we watched, the stranger it seemed. The man never pointed the flashlight ahead to light his path. He kept the beam aimed at the ground the entire time, slowly moving it from side to side as if searching for something very specific. The red covering made the light so dim that if we hadn't been looking directly at the lot, we probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. Caleb suggested that maybe it was the owner of the property checking on something during the night, but even he didn't sound convinced. Who would walk through that overgrown field after 1 a.m. carrying a flashlight covered with red fabric? We kept following his movements until, suddenly, he disappeared behind a cluster of bushes. We waited for him to reappear on the other side, but he never did. The light simply vanished. We kept staring through the window for several more minutes, trying to find it again. When it didn't come back, we decided to go downstairs and tell Caleb's dad, figuring he might know who the person was. His dad was still awake watching television in the living room. Caleb explained that there was a man walking around the empty lot next door with a red flashlight. I expected him to say it was probably a neighbor or someone familiar from the area. Instead, he looked confused and asked if we were sure it was in the lot next door. Caleb confirmed it and pointed toward the window in the living room. His dad stared in that direction for a few seconds before saying something that immediately made me uncomfortable. That lot didn't have any nearby owner. The house that had once stood there had been demolished many years earlier, and the property had remained completely vacant ever since. According to him, nobody had permission to be there. He grabbed a regular flashlight, quietly opened the front door, and shined the beam across part of the lot for a few seconds. There was no one there. No light, no movement. We went back upstairs, assuming the person had left while we were downstairs talking. As soon as we entered the bedroom and Caleb closed the door, I noticed a very faint red glow reflected in the window. It was no longer coming from the empty lot. The light seemed to be just outside the house itself, so close that it illuminated only a small section of the glass. We both stopped immediately before getting any closer to the window. The red reflection appeared for a few seconds, disappeared, and then came back, as if the flashlight was being moved slowly outside. Caleb took 2 steps toward the window, but I grabbed his arm and told him to turn off the hallway light that was still shining through the partially open bedroom door. As soon as the room became completely dark, we could see much more clearly. The faint red glow passed through a small opening in the curtain and moved very slowly across the bedroom wall. It didn't light up the whole room. It was just a weak circle of light sliding slowly across the wall, as if someone were pointing the flashlight directly at the window while standing extremely close to the house. My heart started racing because it meant the man had crossed the entire empty lot without making any noticeable noise. Caleb quietly called for his dad. Before he could even answer, we heard a snapping sound from outside, directly beneath the window. It sounded like someone stepping on a dry branch. His dad ran upstairs and entered the bedroom asking what was happening. Without saying a word, we simply pointed at the red reflection. He slowly approached the curtain, grabbed one edge of it and pulled it open just a few inches to look outside. The moment he looked out, he immediately closed the curtain again. He didn't seem panicked, but it was obvious he had seen someone. He told both of us to stay away from the window and turned off the bedroom light again. Then he grabbed his phone and called the police while walking to another room to observe the backyard through a different window. Caleb and I remained completely silent. A few seconds later, we heard him telling the dispatcher that someone was moving among the bushes beside the house and carrying a flashlight covered with a piece of red fabric. While he gave them the details, we heard another snapping sound from the backyard, this time farther away. We ran to the hallway window overlooking the front of the house. From there, we could see part of the side yard. For just a brief moment, we saw the same red light move quickly between 2 bushes before disappearing toward the woods behind the houses. After that, everything became completely dark again. The only thing that remained was the feeling that whoever that person was knew exactly where he could approach the house without being seen by anyone inside. The police cruiser arrived about 15 minutes later. To me, it felt much longer because nobody in that house could stay away from the windows. 2 officers walked along the side of the house using powerful flashlights, while another remained in front speaking with Caleb's dad. After a few minutes, one of the officers called the others over the radio. They had found fresh boot prints in the damp soil between the empty lot and the side of the house. They also discovered several broken branches directly beneath the bedroom window where we had been standing. One of the officers shined his flashlight on the exterior wall and pointed out muddy marks on the siding, as if someone had been standing very close to the window for quite some time. They followed the footprints into the wooded area behind the houses, but eventually lost the trail where the ground became covered with dry leaves. Before leaving, they asked several times about the red flashlight. They said that detail might help identify the person if they received another similar report. That night, all of us slept in the living room with the lights on. Nobody had the courage to return to the upstairs bedroom. A few weeks later, Caleb told me that the police had arrested a man after residents on another street reported someone watching houses during the early morning hours. They never officially confirmed it was the same person, but officers found a flashlight covered with a piece of red plastic and several pairs of binoculars inside his pickup truck. Caleb's dad was asked to identify some of the recovered items, but investigators never gave him a definitive confirmation. To this day, I still don't know what that man's intentions were, or why he illuminated the ground instead of the path ahead. What stayed with me the most was realizing that he wasn't simply passing through the empty lot. He crossed the entire property without making almost any noise, and managed to get within just a few yards of the window where 2 teenagers were awake, looking outside. Ever since that night, whenever I sleep in a house where the bedroom faces a backyard or an empty lot, the very first thing I do is close the curtains completely. Not because I think it will stop someone from coming closer, but because I'd rather not find out who might be standing silently on the other side of the glass, watching. Story 3. My name is Carter Reynolds. I'm 17 years old, and this happened during the summer of 2023. One of my best friends, Mason Hill, invited us to spend the night at his grandparents' old house in rural Indiana. His grandparents had moved closer to their children a few months earlier, but the house was still used by the family on weekends. That night, Mason's parents had to drive to a neighboring town to deal with an issue involving one of his uncles and said they would be back shortly after breakfast. Since Mason was old enough to stay home alone, they took the opportunity to let me, Dylan Cooper, and Jake Morris sleep over. The house was old, built in an area surrounded by farms and small patches of woods. There were no close neighbors. The house had 2 stories, a huge backyard, and a wooden porch that creaked every time someone walked across it. As soon as his parents left, we ordered burgers, spread our mattresses across the upstairs bedroom, and started a horror movie marathon. It was exactly the kind of atmosphere any group of teenagers would expect from a sleepover. We joked during the movies and spent the entire night trying to scare one another. None of us was actually afraid of anything. It was already past midnight when we paused the movie to grab some soda from the kitchen. Afterward, we returned to the bedroom, turned off the main light, and let the television be the only source of illumination. The bedroom window was behind us, facing the side yard of the house. At one point during a particularly quiet scene in the movie, Dylan stopped talking in the middle of a sentence and stared at the window. I asked what was wrong. He simply told us to look at the glass. When I turned around, it took me a few seconds to realize what he was seeing. Finger marks were slowly appearing on the outside of the window, as if someone were pressing a hand against the glass from outside. First, 2 fingers appeared, then 2 more. A moment later, the full outline of a hand became visible for a few seconds before disappearing. The problem was that the window was on the 2nd floor of the house, several yards above the ground. There was no balcony, no tree, and no nearby structure that would have allowed someone to reach that spot easily. We sat frozen for several seconds trying to come up with an explanation, hoping it was nothing more than a strange reflection from the television. Then a second handprint appeared just a few inches away from the first. None of us spoke for several seconds. The movie kept playing, but nobody was looking at the television anymore. Jake was the first to stand up and walk over to the window. He ran his hand across the inside of the glass to make sure the marks were actually on the outside. They were. We could clearly see small, foggy patches exactly where the fingers had touched the exterior surface. Mason tried to rationalize it by saying that maybe a tree branch had scraped against the glass because of the wind. But all it took was one glance outside to realize there wasn't a tree anywhere close enough. Besides, the marks had the unmistakable shape of a human hand. We stared at the window for almost a full minute, waiting for it to happen again. Nothing. Jake pulled the curtain open just a few inches to look into the yard. The moon illuminated most of the grass, and there was absolutely no one outside. Even so, the silence started making all of us uncomfortable. Mason suggested that we go outside, inspect the area, and settle the matter once and for all. We grabbed flashlights from a hallway closet, and all 4 of us went downstairs together, locking the front door behind us before walking toward the side yard. We spent nearly 15 minutes examining everything around the house. We shined our flashlights on the walls, looked behind the shed, checked the back fence, and walked over to the bedroom window trying to figure out how anyone could have reached it. We found no ladder. There were no boxes, logs, or any object that could have been used as support. The wall was completely smooth from the ground all the way up to the window. Dylan shined his flashlight on the ground beneath it and pointed out that there weren't even any fresh footprints. The soil was dry, but it still would have shown marks if someone had stood there for any length of time. We found nothing. Concluding that we had probably misinterpreted what we'd seen, we decided to head back inside. Mason unlocked the front door, and all 4 of us went back upstairs. The moment Jake stepped into the bedroom, he froze in the doorway. The window was still closed, but the metal latch that was always locked was now in the unlocked position. I clearly remembered Mason checking it before we went outside. Someone had unlocked that window while all 4 of us were outside the house. The moment we noticed the unlocked latch, nobody walked into the room right away. We all stood in the doorway staring at the window. The room looked exactly the way we'd left it, but that one small difference was enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Mason was the first to say he was absolutely certain the window had been locked before we went downstairs. I remembered him pushing the latch down right after Dylan pointed out the handprints on the glass. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shined it across the floor near the window. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Even so, we decided to enter slowly and check every corner of the room. We looked under the beds, inside the closet, behind the door, and even behind the curtains. We found no one. Just as I started thinking we might be overreacting, Dylan pointed out something near the mattresses where we planned to sleep. One of the backpacks had been opened. The zipper was pulled completely to the side, even though I distinctly remembered closing it before we went outside. Nothing appeared to be missing, but several items had been moved. My wallet was lying on top of the mattress instead of inside my backpack, and Jake's phone charger was on the floor near the window. They were small changes, but enough to prove that someone had gone through our belongings while the house was empty. Mason ran to the kitchen landline because cell phone reception on that property was extremely unreliable. While he hurried downstairs to call his parents and the police, the three of us stayed in the upstairs hallway, too afraid to go back into the bedroom. That's when we heard a very faint sound coming from the attic. The house had an attic hatch in the hallway ceiling with a folding wooden ladder. The noise sounded like someone shifting their weight across old wooden boards. We stared at the ceiling without saying a word. A few seconds later, we heard another creak, this time a little farther away. Jake whispered that it was probably just the house settling because of the temperature, but nobody seemed convinced. Before any of us could decide what to do, we heard the front door burst open. Mason's dad had returned much earlier than expected after receiving his son's desperate phone call. As soon as we told him everything, he instructed us not to go upstairs again and waited outside the house for the police to arrive. Even with an adult finally there, I couldn't stop thinking about the same thing. Whoever had unlocked that window knew the house well enough to get in and out without making almost any noise. The police arrived about 20 minutes later and conducted a thorough search of the house. 2 officers started upstairs while another inspected the outside using a flashlight. They entered the bedroom, photographed the unlocked window, and examined the glass where the finger marks were still partially visible. Then they opened the attic hatch and spent several minutes up there. When they came back down, they said they hadn't found anyone hiding inside, but they had discovered something that made all of us uncomfortable. There were fresh footprints in the layer of dust covering the attic floor. The prints led from the attic hatch to a small ventilation window on the side of the house. Outside, one of the officers found that the frame of the vent window had been shifted, as if it had recently been removed and put back in place. They also noticed rubber marks on the gutter and small scratches along the wall, indicating that someone had most likely used a portable ladder and then removed it before we returned from the yard. That explained how the person had reached the second floor window and why we hadn't found any ladder when we searched outside. Whoever broke in knew exactly how long we would be outside and removed every trace before we came back. They never discovered who did it. The police recorded the case as unlawful entry, but nothing had been stolen, and there were no security cameras at Mason's grandparents' house to show who had entered. A few weeks later, one of the neighbors mentioned seeing a white pickup truck parked near the access road that same night, but he couldn't identify the license plate or the driver. To this day, I remember the entire sequence of events far more vividly than the handprints on the glass. What truly scares me is realizing that while the 4 of us believed we were searching for someone outside the house, that person was probably already walking silently through the bedroom, where we were about to lay down our mattresses and sleep. He opened our backpacks, went through our belongings, unlocked the window, and left without making a single sound that caught our attention. Ever since then, whenever I spend the night in an old house, the very first thing I do isn't check the doors or windows. It's ask whether there's an attic and whether anyone has actually confirmed that it's empty. Story 4. My name is Tyler. I was 17 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a small town in rural Indiana. It was the last day of school before the summer break in 2022, and we finally had a few weeks without tests, homework, or any other obligations. My parents had already planned a quick trip to visit my grandparents in Illinois, and weren't expected to return until the following morning. Since they knew me well and trusted me, they let me invite 2 friends over to spend the night playing video games and watching movies. I invited Ethan, who had been my friend since elementary school, and Noah, who had just transferred to our school that year, but had already become part of our group. They arrived around 6 in the evening carrying soda, snacks, and a few extra controllers. The house was a typical 2-story home in a quiet residential neighborhood, with an attic used only for storing old boxes, Christmas decorations, and tools that my dad almost never touched. We left our backpacks near the kitchen door, ordered pizza, and spent hours playing video games in the basement because it was the coolest part of the house during the summer. Everything felt exactly like any other night between friends. If someone had told me at that moment that I would remember that night for the rest of my life, I would have laughed. It was probably around 9:30 when Noah got a phone call. He looked at the screen, stayed silent for a few seconds, and stepped outside onto the back porch to answer it. When he came back, he seemed a little rushed. He said his mom had completely forgotten about a family commitment and needed him to come home that same night because they were leaving early the next morning. It sounded like a perfectly normal explanation. We even joked that he was making up an excuse because he was losing our matches. He laughed, grabbed the jacket he had left on the couch, and headed home after waiting for his dad to pick him up. Ethan and I stood in the garage watching the car drive away before going back inside without thinking much about it. Ethan commented that it was a shame Noah had left so early, but we went back to playing as usual. About half an hour later, we decided to grab more soda from the kitchen, and that's when we noticed that one of the backpacks was still inside the house. It seemed strange because we were sure each of us had arrived carrying only one backpack. At first, we assumed Noah had simply forgotten his. Ethan picked it up so we could call and let him know, but he noticed it was surprisingly heavy. Before calling him, we decided to look for some form of identification inside to confirm that it really belonged to Noah. That was when everything started feeling wrong. The first place we checked was the front entrance, thinking maybe there was another identical backpack and we had mixed them up. There wasn't. We went back to the living room and opened only the smaller pocket, expecting to find a student ID or anything with Noah's name on it. Instead, we found only a few folded clothes, a nearly empty water bottle, and a phone charger. Ethan suggested that maybe his wallet or identification was in the main compartment. When he unzipped it, we saw that there was almost nothing inside besides an old hoodie. No notebooks, no wallet, and not even the handheld gaming console he had brought earlier to show us. That's when I noticed something else that didn't make sense. I had clearly seen Noah place his backpack beside the kitchen door when he arrived, but this backpack was now inside the closet of the guest bedroom in the upstairs hallway. Neither of us remembered moving it there. I tried reconstructing everything we had done since Noah arrived, wondering if one of us had put the backpack in the closet to clear space near the entrance, but none of my memories fit. Even so, I tried to rationalize it. I figured we had simply been distracted. I grabbed my phone to call Noah and ask whether he had actually forgotten his backpack or whether there had been some kind of mix-up. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. While I was sending him a text that simply read, "Dude, you forgot your backpack here." We heard a dull thud above us. It sounded like someone taking 2 slow steps across old wooden boards. Both of us looked up at exactly the same time. The attic was directly above the hallway where we were standing. We stayed silent for several seconds, waiting to hear it again, but everything became completely still. Ethan let out an awkward laugh and said it was probably just the wood expanding or contracting because it was still a very warm night. That explanation made sense. My dad always said the house creaked as it cooled down after a hot day. But before we even finished that conversation, we heard it again. This time they weren't random creaks. They were unmistakable footsteps. 1, 2, 3, with short pauses between them, as if someone were trying to walk quietly. They weren't fast or heavy, but they had a distinctly human rhythm that was impossible to ignore once we focused on them. My stomach instantly tightened. I looked at the pull-down attic ladder, which was folded into the hallway ceiling, and felt the unsettling sensation that someone was standing directly above us, aware that we had heard them too. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Ethan simply nodded toward me, silently asking whether I had heard the same thing. I nodded back without saying a word. I picked up my phone and called Noah for the 3rd time. This time the call was rejected almost immediately. That felt strange because he always answered or at least texted back saying he'd call later. Instead, there was no response at all. I sent another message asking if he had intentionally left the backpack behind, but it remained undelivered. While we waited for some kind of reply, we decided to check whether every door in the house was locked. The front door was secure. So was the back door. The first floor windows looked exactly the way I had left them earlier. That's when Ethan asked, almost in a whisper, whether my parents had gone into the attic that day. I told him they hadn't. My dad avoided going up there because it was filled almost entirely with old boxes. No one had touched that space in months. Silence settled over the house again. Even the television in the basement had been turned off by then. The only sound came from the air conditioner running downstairs. Then we heard something being dragged above our heads, as if a heavy box were being pushed very slowly across the wooden floor. At that moment, I noticed something that still bothers me whenever I think about it. The pull-down attic ladder was completely closed, but there was a tiny gap between the frame and the wooden hatch. A thin stream of dust, almost like sand, fell from that gap and landed right in front of my feet. I stared at it without being able to look away. It wasn't much dust, just enough to show that something up there had recently shifted or vibrated. Ethan took 2 steps backward and said it no longer sounded like the house settling. I grabbed a baseball bat that my dad kept leaning against the hallway closet and climbed onto a chair so I could reach the pull cord for the attic ladder. My hand actually touched it, but I stopped before pulling. At that moment, I realized that if someone really was hiding up there, I would be opening the only path that person needed to come straight down on top of us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it beating in my neck. Without saying a word, Ethan and I looked at each other and made the same decision. I climbed down from the chair. We slowly backed away from the hallway and locked the door leading to the hallway, even though we both knew that an interior door wouldn't stop anyone truly determined to come out. We retreated to the kitchen without taking our eyes off the hallway. By then, I was convinced I needed to call 911, but part of me was still trying to find a less terrifying explanation. I thought maybe a large animal had gotten into the attic through an opening in the roof. Raccoons were common in that area and could make a lot of noise. But before I could talk myself into believing that, I heard a metallic sound from upstairs. It was brief, like someone lightly hitting a pipe with a tool or dropping an object and catching it immediately afterward. That completely destroyed any attempt to rationalize what was happening. I called emergency services and spoke as quietly as I could. I explained that we were alone in the house, that we had heard footsteps in the attic, and that we believed someone might have broken into the home. The dispatcher instructed us not to go upstairs, to stay somewhere safe, and to wait for the officers to arrive. While I was still on the phone, we heard another sound coming from the upstairs hallway. This time it sounded like a doorknob being turned very slowly. The door we had locked began to vibrate gently, not from heavy pounding, but from small repeated movements, as if someone were testing the lock without wanting to make any noise. What happened next confirmed that there really was someone inside the house. While the dispatcher was still talking to me, we heard a click coming from the living room. I looked toward the back door and realized it was open a few inches. I know for a fact it had been locked only minutes earlier because I had personally checked it. We didn't see anyone leave. We only heard rapid footsteps running across the wooden back deck and then through the backyard. Ethan pulled back the curtain just enough to glimpse a dark figure dressed in black, crossing the lawn toward the empty lot behind our street. Almost at the same moment, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers began appearing in front of the house. The officers searched the entire property. They found fresh shoe prints in the dust covering the attic floor. Several boxes had been moved, and there was a small opening at the rear of the roof, just large enough for a thin person to crawl through. One of the officers looked at the forgotten backpack and said something I've never forgotten. Whoever broke in probably knew you would end up searching the whole house looking for that backpack. While you were distracted trying to find it, he had plenty of time to stay hidden above you, waiting for the best opportunity to leave without being seen. The officers tried to contact Noah that same night. When they finally reached his parents, they discovered that he really had gone home because of an unexpected family commitment and hadn't even realized he had left his backpack behind. The next day, he came to my house with his dad to pick it up. When we opened the backpack again in the officer's presence, we noticed something we hadn't realized earlier because we had been so nervous. It was far too light. Noah insisted he had left my house with his school laptop, a change of clothes, a case full of cables, and the handheld gaming console he had brought for us to play. None of those items were inside. The investigators concluded that someone had probably opened the backpack at some point, removed everything that took up space, and hidden it inside the closet to make sure we would eventually find it. While we were walking around the house looking for identification, trying to call Noah, and discussing how to return the backpack, The intruder could remain hidden in the attic without attracting any suspicion. They never identified the person who entered the house. They also never recovered any useful fingerprints because many of the surfaces were covered in dust or had already been touched by us before the police arrived. Today, whenever someone tells a story about a friend forgetting something at their house after a visit, I immediately think back to that night. For a long time, I wondered why the intruder hadn't simply stolen something and left. One of the officers answered that question for me. He said some people break into houses simply to wait for the right moment to come downstairs, when the residents are asleep or distracted. That frightened me more than any other explanation. Since then, I've never spent another night alone in that house without checking every possible entry point before dark, and my parents installed cameras and motion sensors around the property just a few days later. Sometimes I still think about the moment when I almost pulled down the attic ladder. If I had done it, I would have come face to face with whoever was hiding less than 6 feet above my head, and honestly, I have no idea how that night would have ended. Story 5. My name is Logan. I was 15 years old when this happened, and I lived in a residential neighborhood in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was the beginning of the summer break in 2021, and one of my classmates, Brandon, invited me to spend the night at his house after we spent the afternoon playing basketball at the neighborhood court. I had been to his house a few times after school before, so his parents knew me well. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was that the house looked completely different from the last time I'd visited. His dad had been renovating part of the second floor for several weeks. There were tools scattered throughout the garage, drywall sheets leaning against the walls, and a constant smell of paint mixed with sawdust. During dinner, Brandon's dad mentioned that he still hadn't finished an old bedroom at the end of the hallway, so he had sealed off that section of the house with plywood panels to keep anyone from wandering in by accident. He even joked that he didn't want to catch 2 curious teenagers snooping around where they didn't belong. Everyone laughed, and the conversation ended there. To me, it seemed like nothing more than an ordinary home renovation, just like others I had seen before. After dinner, we went upstairs to Brandon's room carrying sodas, snacks, and a video game console I had brought from home. His bedroom was located almost in the middle of the second-floor hallway. From the opposite side of the hallway, even with the lights off, you could clearly see the temporary wall made of plywood sheets completely blocking access to the old bedroom. Some sections still had construction tape attached, and there were small gaps near the base where the wood didn't fit perfectly against the wall. The entire hallway had that familiar construction smell, a mixture of dust, freshly cut wood, and dried paint. We spent hours playing games and talking about summer vacation until we finally turned everything off around midnight. The bedroom window was open because it was extremely hot, and all we could hear were distant insects and the occasional cars passing along the main road a few blocks away. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard 3 sharp knocks coming from somewhere in the hallway. Knock, knock, knock. They were evenly spaced, as if someone were slowly knocking on a wooden door. Brandon opened his eyes almost at the exact same moment I lifted my head from the pillow. We stayed silent for several seconds, waiting to hear it again. The knocks came back in exactly the same rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. No more, no less. Brandon let out a quiet laugh and said it was probably just one of the plywood sheets shifting because of the breeze coming through the hallway window. The explanation sounded reasonable. Houses under renovation often make strange noises, especially with loose lumber and changing temperatures. I agreed because I didn't want to seem frightened by a simple sound. We waited a few more minutes, and eventually the knocking stopped. We talked for a little while longer, turned off the television again, and tried to sleep. Before closing my eyes, I remember glancing toward the bedroom door, which was slightly open, and seeing nothing except the dark hallway, faintly illuminated by the light from a street lamp shining through the stairwell window. There wasn't the slightest movement. Everything looked completely still. I have no idea how much time passed after that. I think it was still the middle of the night when I woke up again, this time with the strange feeling that someone was moving around inside the house. Before I even understood why I had awakened, I heard the same sequence of knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Only now the sound seemed much closer. It wasn't coming from the end of the hallway anymore. It sounded like it was right outside Brandon's bedroom. I immediately sat up and saw that Brandon was awake too, staring at the door. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then we heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was muffled, as if someone were knocking from the other side of a thin wooden wall. Brandon whispered that it didn't make any sense because there shouldn't have been anyone behind that partition. The room beyond it had been completely empty ever since the renovation began. We listened in silence, trying to figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. The more carefully we listened, the more it seemed that the knocking originated from one specific spot on the temporary wall, almost exactly at eye level. Brandon grabbed his phone's flashlight and carefully opened the bedroom door. I followed right behind him. The hallway was completely dark except for the faint glow coming through the stairwell window at the opposite end of the house. When we shined the flashlight on the plywood panels, nothing looked unusual. The sheets were exactly as they had been all evening, secured with screws and wooden braces. We stood there for nearly a full minute without saying a word. I was just about to suggest we go back into the bedroom when the 3 knocks came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time the sound was so close that I could actually feel a faint vibration through the wood itself. Both of us instinctively stepped backward. Brandon ran his hand across the plywood and suggested that maybe one of the boards was loose. As he did, he noticed that a narrow plank near the edge of the structure wasn't completely secured. One of the screws seemed loose, leaving a gap of only a few inches between the board and the wall. He looked at me as if asking whether we should take a look. I hesitated for several seconds, but curiosity eventually won. Brandon held the flashlight while I carefully pulled the edge of the board just enough to create a narrow opening. We barely made any noise. At first, I could only see the dark interior of the unfinished room, filled with exposed framing, insulation, and tools scattered across the floor. Then I slowly moved the flashlight a few inches to the right. My entire body froze. There was a man crouching among the wooden framing, almost perfectly motionless. He was hiding behind the wall studs with only part of his face visible between 2 beams. His eyes were fixed directly toward the hallway, exactly in the direction of the bedrooms. For a brief moment, I thought he hadn't realized we had seen him. But then in the very next second, he slowly turned his head and looked directly at the narrow gap we had opened. I will never forget that feeling. There was no scream, no threat, no sudden movement. Only eye contact. Someone had been hiding there, silently watching the house, and now he knew that we knew he was there. Neither of us reacted immediately. I think we were simply too shocked. We stared at that man for what was probably only 2 or 3 seconds, but to me, it felt much longer. He was thin, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood covering part of his head, and had an unkempt beard. What frightened me most was how calm he looked. He didn't seem surprised that we had found him. He made no attempt to run and didn't say a single word. He simply kept staring through the gap. Brandon was the first to react, grabbing my arm and pulling me backward. As soon as we stepped away, I instinctively pushed the loose board back into place. We ran down the hallway without looking back and practically slid down the staircase. Brandon's dad woke up startled by the noise and came out of his bedroom asking what had happened. I could barely get the words out. I just kept repeating that someone was hiding behind the renovation wall. The moment he realized we weren't joking, he grabbed his phone, called 911, and ordered everyone to leave immediately through the front door. We stood on the sidewalk waiting, staring at the second-floor windows with the overwhelming feeling that the man was still inside. The police arrived only a few minutes later. Officers entered through the front door while others surrounded the backyard and the rear of the property. We remained outside, hearing only their radios and the shouted instructions they exchanged. After some time, one of the officers came out and asked us exactly where we had seen the man. When they searched behind the plywood barrier, they found clear evidence that someone had been living there for some time. There was a folding chair, empty water bottles, food wrappers, a thin blanket, and several cigarette butts hidden among the framing. They also discovered that a small side window in the unfinished room had been forced open several days earlier, providing direct access into the structure without the family noticing. The man, however, was already gone. The officers believed he had escaped through the back of the house while everyone was focused on the second floor. One detective commented that situations like that were more common than most people realized. Houses under renovation often have vulnerable entry points, and intruders sometimes remain hidden for hours, or even days, watching the residents' routines before making a move. The next morning, after I had managed to sleep for little more than an hour, one of the investigators returned to speak with Brandon's family and me. He wanted to know exactly when we had first heard the knocking. and whether we had seen the man make any specific movements. While we answered his questions, Brandon's dad mentioned something that left everyone silent. Over the previous several days, a few small tools had disappeared from the renovation site. Nothing particularly expensive. A pair of pliers, a flashlight, an extension cord, and several bottles of water that he was certain he had left in the garage. Because the renovation had been so busy, he assumed one of the workers had accidentally taken them. After inspecting the area, the officers found several of those missing items hidden behind the plywood partition. Their conclusion was that the intruder entered the house whenever it was empty during the day and remained hidden inside the unfinished section without anyone realizing it. The knocking we heard probably wasn't meant to scare us. One of the officers believed the man had simply been adjusting a piece of lumber, moving a beam, or reaching for something in the dark, accidentally creating that distinctive pattern of knocks without realizing we could hear it from the other side of the wall. Several years have passed since that night, but I still can't look at a house under renovation the same way. Whenever I see hallways blocked off with plywood or rooms sealed behind temporary construction walls, I immediately remember those eyes staring at me through the wooden framing. What frightens me most isn't that we discovered an intruder. It's realizing that he had probably been there long before we ever heard the first knock. While we were eating dinner, playing video games, and casually talking, a complete stranger was hiding only a few feet away, separated from us by nothing more than a few sheets of plywood. If those knocks hadn't caught our attention, we might never have realized he was there until morning. Or perhaps not until he decided to leave his hiding place on his own. The police never identified who that man was, and there was never another break-in at Brandon's house after the renovation was completed and a security system was installed. Even so, whenever I walk past a hallway under construction and notice a narrow gap between two boards, my first instinct is still to avoid looking inside, because part of me still expects to find someone silently watching me from the other side. Story 6. My name is Derek. I was 16 years old when this happened, and I lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It was a weekend in the middle of the summer break of 2023, when my cousin Mason and I went to spend 2 nights at our uncle's house, which was located in a quiet residential neighborhood far from downtown. He and his wife had to travel to another city for a wedding and weren't expected to return until the following morning. Since we were already teenagers and had always gotten along well, they left the house under our care. Their only instructions were not to invite anyone over, and to keep all the doors locked during the night. The house sat on a dead-end street with only a few homes and almost no traffic after dark. The houses were widely spaced apart with large yards and plenty of trees. After putting our things in the guest room, we ordered burgers through an app, played a few rounds of video games, and planned to stay awake until sunrise watching horror movies. It was exactly the kind of night we'd been having since we were kids whenever the family got together during summer vacation. While we waited for the food to arrive, we stepped onto the front porch because Mason wanted to show me a funny video on his phone where the signal was stronger. That's when I noticed an old beige sedan parked across the street, a few yards beyond the house opposite ours. At first, there didn't seem to be anything particularly unusual about it. The car was properly parked along the curb and appeared to be in good condition. What caught my attention was the driver. Even from a distance, I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead without making almost any movement. I pointed it out to Mason, who said it was probably someone waiting for a resident to come outside, or a parent waiting for their kid to finish visiting a friend. It sounded like a perfectly reasonable explanation. A few minutes later, the food arrived. We went back inside and completely forgot about it. At that moment, it was just another car parked on the street. If someone had told me we'd spend hours watching that same sedan without it moving an inch, I would have thought they were exaggerating. After we ate, we went back to the living room and started playing video games. We completely lost track of time. Every now and then, I'd head into the kitchen to grab another soda or some chips, and almost out of habit, I'd glance through the front window. It was during one of those trips that I realized the sedan was still sitting exactly where it had been. The streetlights had been on for quite a while, and nearly every house had its curtains closed. The car, however, hadn't moved even a few inches. I called Mason over to take a look. The driver still seemed to be sitting behind the wheel, but it was hard to be certain because the inside of the car was now almost completely dark. We both stood there silently for a few seconds. Mason joked that maybe it was a private investigator following someone. That actually made some sense. One of my dad's neighbors worked for an investigative company and sometimes spent hours waiting inside his car. We laughed about the idea and went back to the living room. Even so, without realizing it, I started checking the window every time I walked past it. It was probably close to 1 in the morning when we turned off the video game and put on a movie. Before switching off the living room lights, I went to close the front curtain a little more and looked outside once again. The sedan was still parked in exactly the same spot. This time there was one difference. The interior was completely dark and I could no longer make out the driver's silhouette. I stood there for several seconds trying to see through the windshield, but the reflection from the streetlights made it almost impossible. I asked Mason if he could tell whether anyone was still inside. He leaned closer to the window and said he wasn't sure. There could have been someone sitting there, or the car could have been empty. It was impossible to tell from that distance. That started bothering me more than I wanted to admit. Not because a car was parked on the street, but because it simply never left. In such a quiet neighborhood where almost no vehicles passed after midnight, that sedan sitting in the same place for hours began to feel completely out of place. We tried to ignore it and went back to the movie, but neither of us was really paying attention anymore. Every 20 or 30 minutes, one of us would walk over to the window just to see whether the car was still there. And every single time it was. There were no lights on inside it, no one getting in or out, and no sign that the engine was running. Around 3 in the morning, the neighborhood had become completely silent. Even the dogs had stopped barking. The air conditioner hummed steadily inside the house, and it was practically the only sound we could hear. That's when Mason pointed out something I hadn't noticed. The house directly across from the sedan had been completely dark since the beginning of the evening. If someone had been waiting for one of the residents, they would have left long ago. I tried to come up with another explanation. Maybe the car had broken down. Maybe the driver had gone to get help. But if that were the case, why hadn't anyone opened the hood? Why was the car still perfectly aligned with the curb as if it had just been parked? The more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. Shortly before dawn, while the sky was still dark but just beginning to lighten along the horizon, the house's doorbell rang once. Just once, not repeatedly, just a single brief ring. Mason and I immediately got to our feet. We waited several seconds expecting a second ring, but it never came. We slowly walked over to the living room window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. The front porch was completely empty. There was no one on the sidewalk, in the driveway, or near the front door. Then our eyes instinctively shifted to the sedan across the street. The car was still parked exactly where it had been all night. Only now, because the sky was getting brighter, we could clearly see inside. There was absolutely no one in it. The front seats were completely empty. Before we even had time to process that, we heard a very faint sound coming from the back of the house. It was the metallic click of a doorknob slowly being turned, as if someone were trying to open the back door as carefully and quietly as possible. Both of us froze for a moment. The sound stopped almost immediately, but it was enough to convince us that we hadn't imagined it. It didn't sound like someone knocking or trying to get our attention. It was unmistakably the sound of someone carefully testing the doorknob, slowly turning it to see whether it was unlocked. We silently signaled each other not to say anything. We walked quietly toward the kitchen, switching off the light before getting close to the back door. From there, we could see a small portion of the backyard through the window above the sink, but the lighting was extremely poor. The motion sensor mounted on the outside wall hadn't turned on, which meant whoever was out there had stayed outside its range or was standing in one of its blind spots. I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911, while Mason watched through a narrow gap in the curtain. Before the dispatcher even answered, we heard the doorknob turn again. This time it rotated twice very slowly, followed by a gentle push against the door, enough to make the wood creak without actually opening it. That eliminated any doubt that someone was trying to get inside. While I quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher, Mason frantically motioned for me to look through the kitchen window. A shadow was moving across the backyard, low and fast, staying close to the wooden fence as it headed toward the side of the house. We couldn't make out a face, clothing, or any identifying features beyond the fact that it was a person. Whoever it was seemed to know exactly which path avoided triggering the motion sensor. A few seconds later, We heard the side gate close softly, as if someone had carefully shut it instead of simply running away. We remained completely still until we finally heard the approaching sirens. As the first patrol cars entered the street, we watched officers shining flashlights into the backyards and surrounding the area. One of them walked directly over to the sedan. We watched everything from the living room window. After checking the vehicle, he signaled to the other officers. The car was unlocked. There was no one inside. There was no key in the ignition, and the driver's seat was adjusted for someone who had clearly been sitting there for a long time. There was even a disposable cup with partially melted ice still sitting in the center console. The officers spent nearly 2 hours searching the neighborhood. One of them spoke with us afterward and asked exactly when we had first noticed the sedan. When we told him it had been parked there since the beginning of the evening, he wrote it down and asked for the license plate number, which Mason had photographed out of curiosity a few hours earlier. A records check showed that the car was registered in another county but had not been reported stolen. Even so, something about it was unusual. The interior was almost completely empty. There were no documents, no wallet, no backpack, and no personal belongings that could identify the driver. The only item officers found was a folded paper map of the area lying on the passenger seat, with a circle drawn in pen around the street where my uncle's house was located. The officers believed the vehicle had been used solely as an observation point. One of them explained that some burglars spend hours studying a home's routine before attempting to break in, waiting until they believe the residents have gone to sleep. According to him, the single ring of the doorbell may have been nothing more than a way to confirm whether anyone was still awake before trying the back door. To this day, when I think back to that night, what bothers me most isn't the attempted break-in. It's thinking about how long someone sat inside that car simply watching the house. We walked out onto the porch several times, turned lights on, closed curtains, passed in front of the windows, and throughout all that time, we were probably being watched without ever realizing it. After that morning, my uncle installed security cameras on every side of the house, replaced all the locks, and added motion sensors covering the side walkway that had previously been a blind spot. The police never identified who had been driving that sedan or found the person who tried to get in through the back door. A few days later, the car was towed because it remained abandoned on the same street, and no one ever came back to claim it. Whenever I see a vehicle parked in front of a house for far too long, I immediately think about that morning. It could simply be someone waiting for a friend. But ever since then, I've never been able to look at a car that's been sitting in one place for hours the same way again.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.